All right. Hello, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Chris. I'm one half of Nimbin Spagyric Tinctures, and we've been, over the last year and a half, involved with a bunch of people attaining, I guess, greater health and well-being through all layers of their beings, including working with cannabinoid therapies in a range of modalities. And it's some of that experience that brings me toward today's topic. And I'd like to talk about using cannabis and perceiving it as an adaptogenic herb and what that means in terms of how we prepare it and then how we dispense it. And I've never met Dr. Kettelaris before. He had an amazing chat, and it's interesting because a lot of what he discussed this morning I actually intend to talk about as well. I'm not coming from a professional medical background. I'm coming from an esoteric healing background and more of your alternative hippie perspective. So we're going to dovetail on a lot of the information, but I think it'll merely seek to reinforce rather than sort of reiterate. But yeah. Anyway, we'll have a chat and then we'll do some questions. So before I start, I'd like to recap on something that I discussed last time, which was an idea of self, or how we view the self. And I think it's important to view a human entity as a being of three bodies. We've got a physical existence, which we've got an emotional existence, and we have a mental body as well. And these three parts of ourselves interpenetrate, they mutually reinforce each other. It's a complex organisation. It's a complex organisation, and the sum of these three bodies is known as the personality. And the endocannabinoid system is an interesting one because it's my belief that the endocannabinoid system is used by the personality construct to regulate those different parts of the self. We know that it's an interpenetrating system. We know that it governs and regulates a whole bunch of body systems, and clearly it's the mechanism whereby we attain this synthetic, amazing biological machine that we are. Our health, therefore, is an expression of how those different parts of the self are interacting, whether they're communicating functionally or whether they're dysfunctional. And really, healing is just an attempt to increase the free flow of information and informing energies between those different parts of the self. The endocannabinoid system is entirely dedicated to that purpose. Dr. Kettelaris mentioned before that the endocannabinoid system is it's an evolutionary system. That means it's in all aspects of all evolutionary life on Earth. All organisms contain that. Why? That is because it's my belief that is the mechanism whereby the indwelling informing consciousness, a soul for us, controls the organism to achieve the biological goals of life on this planet. And that's why the cannabinoid system governs and helps motivate different body systems to achieve an overall biological goal of life on Earth. Adaptogens are uniquely suited for greater health and well-being because of the way that they work on different aspects of the self in different mechanisms, not just in one direction. So what is an adaptogen? I guess an adaptogen is a special class of herbs that is represented particularly from traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine and indigenous medicine and healing approaches that enables the organism to adapt to stress, hence the name. It's an adaptogen. They should normalise metabolic function. They should restore balance. That's the homeostasis we were referring to before with Dr. Kettelaris. And they should increase your resistance to disease and other stressors. They're also known historically as being rejuvenating herbs, chi tonics, rasayanas, restoratives, different labels depending on the culture from which they've come from. Well-known examples are the ginsengs, astragalus, sacred basil, licorice root, maca powder, maca root. And I'd also like then to suggest that... Sorry, I've lost my point. As I mentioned before, most of them come from the traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic perspective. Both of those are natural plant medicine medical systems with thousands of years of knowledge behind them. So that's where most of your adaptogenic knowledge comes from. Western herbalism and Western treatments only really started to look at adaptogens in the late 40s, and it was basically spearheaded by the Soviets, who were looking to peak athlete performance, their civil service, their soldiers. They really got into this peak performance. That's when they did all the PSI research, and they looked at the Eastern knowledge and went, okay, let's look at these compounds, let's look at what they're doing, and let's try and understand how they work. So originally, in the late 40s, an adaptogen was defined as countering these adverse stressors. Plants are designed for this, obviously, because plants as a kingdom are embedded in an environment, have very little mobility, such as animals, and are subject to incredible environmental stresses depending on their elevation, climatic location, and so on. So, of course, the plant kingdom has had to design a phytochemical system that they exist in that enable them to deal with the stressors. Now, when the animals and humans come along and ingest the plant, we take the phytochemicals in, and then we can use those compounds to deal with our own stresses, whether they're physical or biological or environmental. By 1968, the definition of adaptogens in a Western context had been sort of formalised, and it basically has three components. The first thing is that an adaptogen must be non-toxic. The second thing is that an adaptogen must produce a non-specific response in the organism. It increases generally the power against resistance, and it should do this without depleting cellular energy. You can't, like a stimulant, rob energies and steal and drain and deplete an organ. It's got to generally uplift and enliven, support and enhance for greater function. And the third factor for an adaptogen to be such is that it has to have a normalising effect on systems, and it has to work bidirectionally. This means that it doesn't just activate or deactivate, it will intelligently move in either or both directions simultaneously. And an example of this is with the ginseng. Now, ginseng has compounds like ginsenosides in it, and an example of that is there's RG1 and RG2. Now, RG1 in ginseng will activate your nervous system, but RG2 will suppress it. And your body will ingest from the ginseng whole plant, and it will use and apply either one of those according to how the whole system of the body's working. And adaptogens should, as part of their work, also demonstrate a normalising effect on the body's general metabolic systems, including the neuroendocrine system, which is the brain and the functional organ glands, and also in our immune response. Now, this was coming, remember, from the 60s, which was before the endocannabinoid system had even been discovered. And I would argue that a further action of an adaptogen would be to be working through the endocannabinoids. Thanks to Dr. Catalaris' explanations before, we see is embedded throughout all of the body and involved in almost all metabolic processes. Most adaptogens are also antioxidant, and many of them are also hepaprotective, which means they protect the liver, are cardioprotective, protecting the heart, protect against chemo and radiation poisoning, have anti-tumour and anti-inflammatory effects. And just by listening to those descriptions, it sounds a lot like the effects of cannabis. In conclusion, various active constituents found in herbal adaptogens work to stimulate neuroendocrine and immune systems via multiple metabolic pathways to regulate, normalise, and generally enhance functions. They do this using their entire complex range of compounds, what's known as an entourage effect, where it's not just one compound, one isolate working, it's actually working together in synergy with feedbacks and to mutually support and adjust each other. Now, having explored that concept, I'd like to suggest that we consider cannabis to be an adaptogenic herb, and to then understand what that means in preparation and administration. So before I continue, then let's go back to that original definition of an adaptogen and see if cannabis fits. So the first thing is it must be non-toxic. Now, we know there's no effective lethal dose for cannabis, so it checks out. It's not toxic. However, Having said that, obviously there can be negative consequences from its ingestion, but this is the case for all substances. And this is why it's really important that the material we're using for medical cannabis is clean, is free of fungus, is free of contaminants, is free of herbicides, pesticides, is free from heavy metals. We need to be careful about our harvesting process and storage, and we also need to be careful about the methods we have of extraction. So this goes into the solvent arguments, and personally I'd caution against the use of benzenes and isopropyl alcohols. Personally, I'm a fan of alcohol extracts, and that's ethyl alcohol. There's a number of competing arguments. We've heard from Dr. Ketelaris. There's no obvious answer as to which method we should use to extract our cannabis. There are many methods. The important thing is to be doing it in the cleanest manner we can, because most of the time we're using this for very, very sick people, or if we're using it just as our own general therapies, we don't obviously want to be toxing ourselves out. So please be mindful of how we extract the cannabis so that we're not making it inadvertently toxic. The second rule or classification for an adaptogen is that it produces a non-specific response. An increased resilience is the result against all stresses. Now, when using whole cannabis extracts, we know that we're getting an anti-inflammatory effects and responses, and that's obviously on the physical layer. We know that we're getting anti-anxiety effects, and we're getting a relaxing of the limbic system, particularly in the amygdala, which is the area of the brain that processes fear and so on. That's that relaxed, let's not get stressed out effect that we clearly see is activating through our emotional centre. We also have anti-anxieties that tend to chill down the mental perspective, although obviously high THC doses are going to activate the mental body. Also, I think what's really important is that the effects of cannabis on the spiritual body, which also shouldn't be discounted, and part of our full whole person alignment is facilitated with whole cannabis extracts. The third categorisation for adaptogens, or the third criteria, is it should have a normalising effect on physiology, and that should be bidirectional. And I think we get this because we've had previous discussions on how, for instance, CBD down-regulates or mitigates the intoxicating effects of THC. We'll also find stuff like CBG, cannabidiol, which is a precursor for CBD and THC, will have analgesic effects, anti-anxiety effects. Different compounds, whether they're the cannabidiols or whether they're terpenoids, will have cross-correlating effects. And so this is demonstrating adaptogenic concepts. However, obviously this is important why we can't be relying on isolates and extractions, and why it has to be a whole plant process, because otherwise we're going to be leaving out terpenoids, cannabinoids, and we're not going to get the whole package. The cannabinoid system also activates and deactivates its own receptors. This is what's known as the stoner's tolerance. We all know that the more cannabis you may ingest, as time builds up, you develop a tolerance. Now, the way this happens is the endocannabinoid system has an active feedback system, and it'll actually shut down receptors. It shuts them down and regulates the physical quantity and quality of those receptors depending on the amount of cannabinoids coming in. We don't need a lot of cannabinoids. It's a very finely tuned system that is designed to use small amounts to achieve great results. Cannabinoids also interact with each other by facilitating the terpenoid effects by changing the blood-brain barrier permeability. That's one of those effects, and the terpenoids themselves down-regulate the effect of the cannabinoids. We need to have them all. So it would appear that all three criteria are fulfilled by cannabis for it to be an adaptogen. It works on the central nervous and immune systems. It works on the neuroendocrine and limbic systems. It modulates neurotransmitters and your immune system through our mental body, and it moderates the synthesizing actions of the personality construct as it interacts with the other three parts of the self. Yes, there can be adverse effects, but all of these, when managed, are actually pathways to healing. Some of the common effects what would be considered adverse effects of THC or cannabinoid therapy are tachycardia, which is an elevated heart rate, which is essentially just your freaked out body brain from way too high THC, and is often just relieved through steady, slow breathing. We get the dry mouth, the cotton mouth, again through very high elevated THC levels. Obviously, that's rehydration is easy and important. We can have dizziness, again, through high THC and the anxiety complex. Hypoglycemia as a result of burning sugars as we activate THC frontal lobe stuff happening here. And then also there's the dissociation and the schizophrenic episodes that some people will experience too. Again, high THC doses, and I would argue that is basically indicating a cleavage and a partition personality construct. We can work towards healing those issues, and that's actually showing you another pathway through to psycho-spiritual development. What you'll notice is that the whole plant extracts negate these negative effects, and almost all of them are caused by elevated levels of THC. This has important implications as to why we may or should not decarboxylate, and why we may or may not want to have elevated levels of THC in our medications, particularly these cannabis extracts. Western medicine's understanding of adaptogens is still playing catch-up, and this is why we heard Dr. Kettelaris reference this as in medicine, mainstream Western medicine can't actually understand all of the pathways under which these healings are achieved. This is because we need to change the paradigm. We need to accept that there is a non-localised intelligence that governs these processes. We can't know where the intelligence is, and it's certainly not locked in our brains. There is obviously a greater pathway at play. The recently emerging theory in Western medicine of endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome, which Dr. Kettelaris also mentioned, supports the contention that cannabis is an adaptogen. It demonstrates that the endocannabinoid system is a critical functioning component of our physiology. It was first proposed in 2003 by Dr. Ethan Russo, who was looking at the possibility of the fact that a chronic deficiency in any kind of neurotransmitter system results in diseases. And he was looking at acetylcholine deficiency and its association with Alzheimer's, with serotonin deficiency and its relation with depression, with dopamine deficiency and its correlation with Parkinson's disease. And so he realised that if we have an endocannabinoid system and there are deficiencies there, then perhaps that leads to syndromes. And what was further discovered under further research was that, in particular, migraines, fibromyalgia, gastrointestinal upsets such as irritable bowel disease, and a whole bunch of the autism spectrum disorder were strongly correlated with extremely low, chronically depressed levels of either endocannabinoid levels in the body, but also receptor sites. For instance, the autism spectrum disorder patients who were studied, and there's particular classes of that spectrum where there's actually almost a doubling of the physical quantity of CB2 receptors in those patients. So if we've got twice as many receptors, we actually need twice as much substance to fill those receptors and have them functioning. And what they found was that it was basically, by default, a deficiency of endocannabinoids because they had twice as many receptors to charge. As soon as they supplemented the therapies with extra cannabinoids, there was amazing results. And then they also found a cross-correlation between people who suffer from migraine, fibromyalgia, gastrointestinal upset, all responded incredibly well to endocannabinoid therapy, and thus the deficiency syndrome. I'm not a big fan of syndromes, but I think that it's an important example of how Western medicine is grappling to try and understand a system it's just discovering. What was also discovered was that what was known as the lipid profile that Dr. Kettelaris is referring to as well, is in terms of our omega-3 levels, were chronically suppressed in all the people who were suffering from these conditions. And again, omega-3 therapy has proven to be extremely effective in reversing and helping to heal some of these chronic conditions. This is one of the reasons why Nimbin Spagyric Tinctures recommends the ingestion of both cannabinoids and hemp seed oil. I'm actually a fan of the hemp seed oil, despite Dr. Ketelaris's views on it, to enable a high level of omega dosing to enable the endocannabinoid system to do what it really wants to do. And I'll actually suggest that those two things should be ingested together. And I'd recommend tincture into the oil, into the mouth, for those reasons. I'm not going to go over all the clinical deficiency stuff because Dr. Ketelaris, I think, really did that quite well. But the omega-3 in particular is a really important cofactor nutrient and one that just definitely needs to be supplied in the diet. So if there is an embedded cannabinoid system and it is responsible for multiple physiological functions and clinical deficiencies, it seems possible, and the cannabinoids have the capacity to bidirectionally regulate these processes, surely this confirms cannabis's capacity to be used as an adaptogen. So then what implication does this have for the preparation and dispensing of medical marijuana? Well, I think the first thing it means is that the complex actions on the cannabinoid system via the entourage effect need to be recognised for what they are, so that we need to put a whole plant extract in. And by that I mean roots, stem, leaf and flower inflorescences. Now, one of the reasons for the inclusion of the root compounds in particular is that CBG, cannabigerol, which is a precursor for THC and CBD in the plant itself. It exists in very large quantities in the roots and migrates up the plant structure to then precipitate into all the cannabidiols and the terpenoids that need to be created. I find it interesting that the analysis that's been referenced before to cannabis samples shows that no Australian cannabis contains CBD. I'm starting to think that plants don't actually, although I haven't done all the research, that the cannabis plant itself probably almost never produces CBD. And I suspect that we generate CBD in our body through the endocannabinoid system, and we actually use the CBG ourselves to do that. Plant extracts, for anyone who's made cannabis extracts, I'll challenge you to put some root compounds in, and by that I mean root structures of the cannabis plant, and taste the difference in the extracts. They are qualitatively and quantitatively different. They taste different and they act differently. And I think that CBG is the key, but that's more research required, and I'd love to have some more analysis done through perhaps a university if we can get there. I think that not only do we need to work on whole plant extracts, but I also seriously question the need to decarboxylate. Now, we had a little bit of a discussion on that previously, because some of the rationale behind decarboxylating, which is also known as activating our cannabis, has some interesting consequences. For a start, most of the research that was initially done on decarboxylation was done by a Dutch guy whose name escapes me at the moment. But he was actually working his material on water extracts only, and he was measuring relative levels of THC-A and THC, CBD-A and CBD in water extracts he'd made from cannabis. And one of the problems with that is that only by basing it on a water extract, he's not getting a true profile. And second to that, his results were contradictory in that they showed that while THC is more bioavailable than THC-A, CBD-A is more bioavailable than CBD. So to decarboxylate the cannabis is going to increase the bioavailability of THC, which is responsible for all the negative consequences, and limit the bioavailability of CBD, which it would seem is responsible for almost all the positive effects. To me, that's not making sense. I don't understand why we do that. We don't want to get our tumours stoned. We want to cannabinate them functionally. So personally, we don't carboxylate our medicines. We do cold extracts. It is argued because some people believe that alcohol itself will, in effect, partially decarboxylate cannabis. I don't know that. I'm not sure. Perhaps a chemist can help me understand that. But we believe that if we can take a cold extract of the whole plant, preserve it in high-grade alcohol, and then gently apply minimal heat to do a reduction concentration, we're getting the highest, fullest cannabidiol profile and not smashing out the terpenoids, which are really, really delicate. That's why you can smell them on a summer's day. They are that volatile. For the full complement of cannabinoids, we need the whole plant extracts, as I've said. I'm not going to go over the CBD arguments and the terpenoids and what they are and what they do. Suffice it to say that it's just guesswork at this point. As Dr. Ketelara says, nobody really knows which ones do which, but what we do know is that we have personal preferences. Everybody needs to experience their own cannabis therapy to understand exactly which part of the plant's working for them and exactly which preparations they want. We don't just do an alcohol extract. It's possible to do glycerin extracts, which are a different method of extraction, which make a whole bunch, because of the processes are different, makes a different range of cannabinoids available in a different proportion to any kind of heat extraction or alcohol extraction, and different again to any kind of butane or other solvent extraction. The preparation of whole plant extracts and the understanding of the endocannabinoid system also helps to explain, as was mentioned in that question that was asked before for Dr. Catalaris about an amount or a quantity of cannabis that should be taken, or cannabidiols that should be taken to achieve a goal, a healing or a result. And there is no finite amount, is the short answer. I get a lot of people saying, how many milligrams do I need to take for over how many days to achieve this goal? And the answer is it depends, because we are all different, unique beings. As Dr. Ketelara said, you need to find your dose. There is no set dose, not even for a condition and definitely not for a person. We always use the expression to find your dose, and you start low and you just gradually increase on a daily basis in very small amounts to achieve that satisfied position, that healthy well-being that Dr. Ketelaris referred to, without overdosing. And overdosing has a heaviness to it, or a slight, almost a fogging, but not quite a fogging, is how most people describe it. That demonstrates, and I have people that will use as little as a single drop, and I have people who use as much as a whole dropper full of cannabis in a single dose, depending on who they are and what they're trying to achieve and what they're trying to treat. And that amount that never remains constant, even across a single individual. Over time, the cannabinoid system regulates, and you'll need to increase or decrease accordingly. But the short answer is that everybody could benefit from cannabinoid therapy, but everybody needs to find their dose. We need to move away from a mechanistic model where it's the one-size-fits-all, it's the magic bullet, and if I do that, then that will be fine, because that's not how life works, really, as we're seeing. The other implication is that it's important to focus on diet and lifestyle. Again, we touched on this earlier with Dr. Ketelaris. It's not just about a magic bullet. If I take medical marijuana, my cancer will be gone, or my autism will be suppressed, or I won't seizure anymore, game over, life's wonderful. No, that's not how it is, and we need to profoundly change lifestyles, habits, diets, outlooks, both mental and spiritual. It's a whole being transition, and that requires ongoing interaction and support, which is why also I'm not a fan of anonymous and random dispensations. When people are undergoing cannabis therapy for whatever purpose, they should be having the support that they require to functionally affect the changes that they need across all parts of their self. And that's also an important part of an emerging medical marijuana paradigm and understanding. This is not just about putting a substance in your body and walking away thinking you're fixed. It's not like that. I'd also like to point out that the important role of industrial hemp, as evidenced by the fact that we don't need a high THC strain. You don't need to go and get 22% THC super skanky buds to heal yourself. You don't. Under the current legal framework, which we know is extremely restrictive here in Australia, you cannot get a licence to grow cannabis for medical marijuana. You can get a licence to grow industrial hemp, and you are allowed to extract from those hemp products that you're allowed to grow. You can make extracts. it gets a little bit tricky in terms of making those extracts available then, particularly off-site. But on-site, you are actually allowed to do this. And the beauty of this is that some of the low THC industrial hemp strains have very high terpenoid levels, very high cannabidiol levels other than THC. Obviously, they have to generally be under 1% for approval and so on. We've done some initial trial work on some industrial hemp extracts which show great promise. They've got some very powerful analgesic effects. I've run some informal trials through some of my discrete patients and have had some subjective feedback to demonstrate that they are just as effective, if not more effective, than some of the full spectrum cannabis extracts that we've done. And again, this is another area of research I'd like to move into because it's going to be the easiest pathway for us to get a functional medical cannabis movement going without changing that regulatory framework and declassifying it as a class drug and all of that. So I'd strongly encourage people to support and develop and go for gold with the industrial hemp. And if we can selectively, not all the strains of industrial hemp are appropriate for medicine making, and you need to grow your industrial hemp differently for different purposes in a slightly different way than you would just say for fibre or for seed. There is a slight difference. Some of it's about the strains and some of it is about the processing of the plant and the growing. It's something that I'd like to work more on, and we'll keep you posted on that one. So, in conclusion, cannabis is an amazing herbal support product, and it can achieve amazing healing benefits in people when it's used in conjunction with active, sane changes to diet, active omega-3 support, or the lipid supply of your choice. I still would prefer to go hemp seed and hemp seed oil. It involves regulation of sane sleep, physical activity, the movement of the lymphatic system. We need emotional balance. We need sane mental perspectives. We need a sane spiritual outlook. And we need to really deal with our dysfunctional habits. We've all got them. All of this can be supported with cannabinoid therapy, but we also need adjunct therapies and supports to support the weakest link. We're all different beings. We've all got organ systems, histories, accidents, genetics that predispose us one way or another through one system or another. That's the weak link. We, in conjunction with cannabinoid therapy, can support the weak link and thus achieve greater health and well-being. And in that aid, we're currently working on a whole range of support protocols for various conditions as they are presented to us for sane healing and moving forward out of those conditions. Some of them involve cannabinoid therapy, some of them don't. Some of them just involve other plant extracts. We make several dozen. They're all made according to traditional spagyric alchemical herbal approaches, which involves more than just extracting alkaloids out of the plant. It also involves purifying the herbal residues and infusing them with a cosmic consciousness and an informing intelligence, which dovetails nicely with the cannabinoid system that the body's got. It's designed to take these substances in and just use them. We're in the process of constructing a range of support protocols, as I said, a range of extracts. Some people can't ingest alcohols, as I've mentioned, so we do glycerins. And we're also working with a number of growers of industrial hemp to expand the range of cannabinoid therapies that are available. I'm at the end. I'm not going to go over a lot of what Dr. Ketelaris has already been on, so I've actually just cut my talk a little bit. But if there's any questions and answers, please go. Yeah, just yell. As in seed available to buy? No. No, but I'm sure that, I'm going to say no loudly through the microphone, but I'm sure that if you very quietly and tactfully were to approach the right person, I'm sure somebody would be able to assist you. We have a lovely seed exchange in Nimbin, but it's very informal. Yes.
The alcohol you buy in a bottle at the emporium, is that one you would recommend?
That is one I would recommend as a backup. I would recommend firstly actually procuring your own alcohol as a superior solution.
Where would you get that from?
You would distill your own would be the best thing to do. If it's not possible, then that would be the next best. It would certainly be better than a commercially produced alcohol. Some people like to do an Everclear or a high 60% spirit. Some of those have fillers and stuff in them. That I have used and haven't had problems with. Yes. You can use fish oil, but most studies will show that plant-based omegas are far more bioavailable than animal-based omegas. And what's that? You could, but also some of the methods whereby they produce the fish oil and where they come from and some of the other bits you're going to get along with that, I would strongly recommend against ingesting fish-based omega oil unless you're taking it out of a whole fish, as in eating your sardines and high oily fish. But in terms of an extracted fish oil, I'd suggest not that one. Yes. So I was actually referring to the lady at the back. Yes, you with your finger up. I'm not a fan of isolates, so I would never say, yeah, just go and chase that CBD. But that's just my understanding of it. Obviously, you could put them together again, but then you're extracting CBD from one plant, you're extracting THC from another. They might go together a bit, but I couldn't see why you would bother going through the double extraction to then put them back together. Why not just take the whole extract from the plant and let your bod do it? I'm just... CBD levels, apparently that's right, but that was what I was referring to before. Do any of the world's cannabis plants have high CBD levels? I don't know. And if they do, what do they? And I'm just saying, because I haven't looked into the research on it, I'd be really interested to find out why the Australian ones don't, which ones did, and whether or not there was any change in where those plants came from, whether the sample product was the same, whether they were sampling exact direct vegetative matter, was it fresh matter, was it stale matter, was it a whole plant part or not? All these questions, until we know that, we don't know whether the survey was in any way complete or not. So I hesitate to say one way or another. It just seems that way. Possibly, but however, that's also not taking into account, that's just assuming that if there must be CBD in the plant present according to how they tested it, for it to then appear in the body. But if we can ingest other cannabinoids and produce CBD in the body at source, we don't need to ingest CBD, is my point. But again, we're still learning about all this. There's no definitive answer. Yeah.
You were talking at the beginning about the relationship between the mind, the emotions, and the body.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in this concept of the cannabis plant being an adaptogen. I work with adaptogens myself, and as much as I see cannabis being an adaptogen, it seems to have another level, and that's its psychotropic effect, its psychedelic effect in a sense. And so it could perhaps be considered an entheogenic adaptogen.
Yeah, sure.
So my question is relating back to what we heard earlier, and the way that habits and beliefs, negative thought patterns relate to illness and different types of conditions. I'd like to know whether you're developing a support protocol which educates patients in how cannabis can be used to change our thought patterns and our habitual behaviours.
Yeah, nice question. And by default we are, because every consult that we would have with any person always starts with patterns and behaviours and outlooks. And through the extended work that we've been doing, absolutely a person's daily routine and all that that involves from their self-view down is fundamental to not only who they are, but where they're going and whether or not they're going to be successful in achieving change. And cannabinoids can play a part in that, but I would suggest that it is just as important. Cannabinoids play a part in that, but the tinctures that we prepare, particularly in the spagyric form that I made reference to, which contains an intelligence that I would say is analogous to the intelligence that guides the endocannabinoid system, means that sometimes, as long as someone is ingesting an alchemical tincture, that's actually what leads the process. And the fact that it is either a cannabis tincture or a lemon balm tincture or a garlic tincture is actually irrelevant. And it is the consciousness that is captured in that that actually engenders the change. And yes, we are developing protocols that support that, and part of that is actually bringing someone's awareness to the fact that psycho-emotional changes are almost inevitable and should be anticipated and managed actively. And so that how to manage them. First part of management is to be aware of them. The second part is to make sure that you support those changes in the most sane way. Most people who are coming for assistance already have that motivation. They're coming because they don't want to be where they are anymore. So that, yep. Yep. Always. Usually, particularly depending on the health status of someone, I usually get a primary carer as well as a patient as well. So the primary carer is usually the closest person to them anyway, and yes, they are also always supported and given the heads up on that, and that is part of that greater support role. Yes, definitely. Most of the time, particularly in this paradigm here, where people have to actually actively seek cannabinoid therapy, have to come to somewhere like here to do that, they're already halfway on that journey to self-determining their healing process. We just stand behind and just guide and push. Yeah? If that answers. Yep.
Just on the psycho-spiritual, keeping it positive thing.
Yep.
I did a 10-day retreat in January at the Gawler Foundation for Cancer.
Yep.
In Victoria. They've had 27 years of experience with cancer patients and MS patients.
Yep.
They recommend 7 points to curing cancer, which include sunshine, exercise, diet, supplements, and meditation was one of the 7. On a pie chart, they showed meditation was 80% of the cure, and the other 6 factors was fitted into a 20%.
Yep.
This is after 27 years of...
Yep.
We also had a man from professor from Monash University who's been doing a course there for 22 years to young doctors called Mind Over Body, whereby he implores young doctors to teach their cancer patients how to meditate, and it's seen as, in my own case in particular, it's been miraculous in as much as I'm coping without chemicals and without the sort of stuff that's been forced on me by the medical profession.
Yep.
And at times when I get to panic levels and stuff like that and fear of it all, nothing fixes it like a half-hour meditation. So I've been doing meditation in the morning and every evening now since January, and it's changed my life. I just thought I'd put that one in for you.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. And what you're expressing there, fabulous. What you're expressing there is the mindfulness of the organised personality that should sit up and above, beyond the mental and emotional and physical busyness that's happening, and only through meditation will you be able to abstract, to then learn to observe without acting, which is in its own way integrating and aligning, because you're abstracting yourself out of your little biological bubble and your emotional and your mental and you're seeking some clarity out of the self. And so that is amazingly empowering, of course, because it teaches us to pay attention to what's going on, to not react, to be able to feedback, absolutely. And part of this whole process of finding one's dose with medication of cannabinoids is part of that mindfulness. You have to pay attention. No one's going to give you the script, here it is. You need to listen. And only you will know whether you've tipped beyond or you're not quite there. And so, yes, it is a form of mindfulness that we should all be practicing, absolutely, and good on you for that. Beautiful. Well done. We should all be meditating more. Yeah.
Yeah, the question I had before was, the woman over here sort of answered it, was around the oils, the lipids.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned that from your experience, the vegetable-based omega-3s were, you found, quite superior to the animal-based, whether that be fish or other animals. Yep. They're very chemically, they're very different. Biochemically, they're very different. One's short chain, one's long chain.
Yep.
And I've heard, my understanding has been that the long chain are much more bioavailable, but you're saying something quite different. I'm just interested in that, and perhaps you can elaborate. Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, off the top of my head, no, I couldn't. I could certainly go and dip my head into lipid chemistry and probably come back with a sane answer.
That's the last question.
I guess part of it also is we're all different. We're not all going to agree on the same thing, or not all bodies are going to be able to accept the same products as it is anyway. So again, know thyself, know what works for you or the next person, have a general understanding of which way we should be aiming, and then see how it settles down for you personally. Because there's not going to be a hard and fast rule, and to be honest, I don't know enough about lipid chemistry to be able to give you an honest answer. So I would generally, it seems logical and understandable that if we're going to most plant substances generally, especially when well managed, are more easily digestible than animal proteins generally, notwithstanding a few changes that might be added through cooking and substance and so on. So I'm always going to use that sort of common sense to apply it. But we're an amazing adapting machine anyway. We can break things down and bust them up. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I guess, I seem to be co-evolved with animals, and I noticed Dr. Kevin talking before that he was not so mad on saturated fats, and I think there's a lot of this, and personally from my experience, I've still got something I go with.
Yep.
Because I think they tend to be demonised.
Sure. Yep.
As we co-evolve with animals, the whole endocannabinoid system would be related to that world.
Yep.
I'm not saying plant-based nutrients and oils, lipids are not going to be helpful.
Sure.
They are, but it makes a lot of sense to me that animal-based, and I hear a lot about saturated fats, and I think it's a lot of, it doesn't fit to me.
Sure. Yep. And I think it's also important to remind us, let's not get over-anxious about food. Let's not get too hooked up on it. Let's just apply common sense and be gentle with ourselves. Yeah? Yeah. All right. I'll be outside.